Ch.4 is about drugs that affect the gastrointestinal tract. These are some of the most common things that we treat animals for in veterinary medicine. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about how we can alter GI function by using drugs, and in particular, a couple of conditions that, while they may be protective, eventually we want to stop, and that is vomiting and diarrhea. And we also need to treat ulcers, which is not an uncommon thing in a variety of animals, not just our small animals. And then we're also going to talk a bit about rumen motility and how we treat that for ruminants. So the types of drugs we're going to be talking about are emetics, which are drugs used to induce vomiting, antiemetics, which are used to stop vomiting, and then antidiarrheals, hopefully that's self-explanatory, laxatives, drugs that help the facilitation of passage of feces, and antacids and anti-ulcer drugs, other anti-ulcer drugs, and then some other ones. Now, your book has a description of the different types of anatomy involved in the GI tract in different species, and you have just covered that, I believe, in your anatomy class. And if you aren't concurrently taking your anatomy class with this class, you should maybe pull out and review some of that in your notes, because we're going to dive down a bit, especially into the autonomic nervous system and some other areas of control of the GI tract. So if you will go ahead and review these next set of slides on your own, I'm just going to go through them really fast. It's just kind of helping you to remember some of the anatomy. Now, we've already talked about gastric when we talked about the anti-inflammatory drugs, because both NSAIDs and steroids have an effect on the stomach. So we've used that term gastric, and hopefully you're familiar with it. Enteric, we're going to be using that term to talk about the duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. And colonic refers to the colon. Just putting this out here. We've certainly talked about over-the-counter drugs. I just wanted to make sure that you know that acronym as you see it in my slides. So GI tract. These are some of the most common disorders that we treat animals for. And the typical signs, vomiting and diarrhea, are some of the most common signs, but they aren't very specific necessarily to any type of condition. We talk about bloat in basically ruminants. Bloat will refer to the rumen. Colic refers to and I should also say bloat can also refer to in dogs. We have a condition called gastric dilatation volvulus. Their stomach gets twisted, and it causes a distension of the abdomen. And so some people will refer to that as bloat, but mostly they're referring to, a twist in the stomach, and they'll use that term gastric dilatation volvulus, or GDV. Excuse me. Colic is something that we typically refer to in horses. It's any kind of abdominal discomfort, and there's a variety of things that can cause that, from reproductive organs to the gastrointestinal tract, parasites, a variety of things that can cause that condition. Ulcers can occur in any species, diarrhea, vomiting, constipation. So I want to just say that in general, when we see conditions such as vomiting and diarrhea, and anything that is disturbing the GI tract, and vomiting and diarrhea are the most common, we will typically give owners a very beginning, it's non-specific therapy. We don't know what's going wrong with the animal, but it is never usually a problem. Rabbits may be a problem because we need to kind of keep their GI tract going. But for 12 to 24 hours, usually it's not a problem to fast animals. So we will tell owners to not feed the animals. That's not going to kill the animal. It may kill the owner because That's our major interaction with our pets, right? Is to feed them, and as long as they're eating, that is a very um, happy thing and a bonding between us. But we want to rest the gastrointestinal tract when we're seeing vomiting and diarrhea, so that we hopefully will stop those two things. And usually, it's not a problem in an animal that has diarrhea, has vomiting. Owners will not feed them, right? Because that's going to cause them to vomit again. But then when we start to return them to a diet, we will go to a bland diet appropriate for the species, start them off with small amounts frequently, make sure that we don't continue to see these signs, and then slowly return them to a normal diet. And once we figured out what the problem is as well, what's causing the vomiting and diarrhea, and then we'll correct fluid and electrolyte imbalances. So, as long as the animal is not vomiting, we can give them access to water, and we want to do that, especially with diarrhea, because an animal can become dehydrated. But uh, if we have to, with a vomiting animal, we may need to correct that fluid loss with uh, either subcutaneous or intravenous fluids. So that's non-specific therapy, and you should always think of it in a vomiting animal or an animal with diarrhea, that we want to look at, make sure that we're maintaining fluids on these animals and not contributing to the GI tract problem by feeding them. So taking them off the food for a while and then returning them to an easily digestible diet. So, what affects the GI tract function? The autonomic nervous system is the thing that I think of it as automatic nervous system in the case of the GI tract, because we don't have to think about digesting our food. So that's an important control over the GI tract, and we can alter that with drugs. The endocrine system, some hormones have control over the GI tract, and we'll talk about those specifically when we get to them. There are some cellularly released compounds. We've already talked about prostaglandins in the anti-inflammatory chapter, and so we'll be talking about them again, and how stomach acid is controlled, um, and how we have digestion. So all of those things come into play. And then intestinal microbes, and especially in the case of ruminants and even monogastrics, when we talk about the small intestine, if we get an imbalance of the good bacteria, we can have cause some real harm in animals. So we have to sometimes help those intestinal microbes return to the normal types that will facilitate proper digestion. So the autonomic nervous system, we're going to talk about this a lot. So you're going to need to commit some things to memory if you remember. So we're going to not talk about central nervous system. The autonomic is in the peripheral nervous system, the efferent or motor part of it, and then here's our autonomic nervous system. This is our voluntary movement, but this is our involuntary or automatic, is what I like to think of it as, but it's properly called autonomic. And we're going to talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So if you remember, these two nervous systems are always acting on the body, and one is more predominant than the other at any one time. I'm not having you memorize or go through this. Hopefully you saw something similar to this in your anatomy class, but it should be apparent that the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system act on the same organs. It's just a matter of which predominates at that time. They have a little different route in some cases, but in general, they affect the same systems. So the parasympathetic nervous system, when we have drugs that mimic the parasympathetic nervous system or stimulation of it, those are called parasympathomimetics. If you think about mimetic as mimicking, we're going to talk about sympathetic um, nervous system drugs that that mimic that system. So those are sympathomimetics. So look at, when you see these long words, look at this suffix to give you a hint as to what kind of drugs those are, because this term is used in literature about drugs. So parasympathetic system is otherwise known as, hopefully my little friend here gives you a hint, it's the rest and restore system, right? So when we look at that, when we are resting and restoring, we're going to be digesting. We're going to be just resting and letting food be digested. So things like stomach acids get secreted into the stomach to help our digestion. We're going to get also secretion of that mucus that protects the stomach. We're going to have stimulation of the GI tract as far as gastric and enteric movement of the food through the system to be digested and absorbed, and then we're going to have defecation in the end. So that's the effect on the GI tract of the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system, hopefully I'm giving you a little hint with this little guy down here, is the fight or flight system, right? And when we're running away and we are going to fight something, we don't need that blood flow to go to our GI tract. So all of the things I talked about with that were stimulated in the parasympathetic nervous system as far as the GI tract goes, we're going to stop that. We're going to shunt the blood away from the GI tract. We're going to make it be more still, and we're going to focus on being able to run away or fight an animal. So drugs that stimulate the sympathetic nervous system are called sympathomimetics. Again, that suffix of mimetics, mimicking.